Hello, I am Curt Fields. You usually see me as General or President Ulysses S. Grant, but today I am speaking to you from my library as Curt Fields, and I'm very pleased to be having a book talk with you for the Civil War Roundtable Congress and of which I'm a part, a contributor, a supporter, and I can't praise it enough. If you're not already involved with the Civil War Roundtable Congress, you should be involved with it in some capacity. The program is wonderful, encompassing the entire war before, after, and it's well worth your time and your money should you wish to contribute to the Civil War Roundtable Congress for you to be active. You have your orders. But as I said, I'm Curt Fields, and I am the co author of this book, Unconditional Surrender, Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. And I co wrote it with Chris Mikowski of Emerging Civil War, and I will speak about Chris and how this came to be. It's published by Savas Beatty Publishing. It's number 63, I think Chris told me, in the Emerging Civil War series of books. And I'm very pleased that it's out, and I would hope that you read it, and even more so, hope you enjoy it. And if you do enjoy it, write a review for Amazon.com, Amazon Books. Those reviews really help, even if they're a sentence. All you have to say is, I liked the book. It was a good book. Now, if you didn't like the book, send me at Curt Fields at generalgrantbyhimself.com. Curt Fields, CurtFields at generalgrantbyhimself.com and send me your comments. I'd be happy to interact with you, and in later editions, I think there will be other editions issued. We can incorporate your suggestions and your comments and make it an even better book so everybody can enjoy it. Now, the book came to be written in something of, I would think, being a new writer, a novice writer. This is my first time on the bookshelf. Uh, when I met Chris Mikowski, and I don't remember meeting Chris, it seems like Chris Mikowski of Emerging Civil War. I think everybody knows Chris Mikowski. But when I met Chris, not long after, he said, "Hey, pal, you ought to write a book." And of course, at that time, yes, I had thought about writing a book. In fact, I'd even made an attempt or two at putting something down, and it had more than just crossed my mind. But I was so I was taken aback by Chris's enthusiastic, "Hey, pal, you ought to write a book." And I actually, with him, mugged a little bit and did the taxi driver thing where I looked around both ways and said, "You talking to me?" And fortunately, Chris got a laugh out of it. And then we stopped laughing. And I said, "You're serious?" He said, "Very. I think you should write a book." And then he was very kind when he said, "Who better to write a book about Ulysses S. Grant than you?" At the time, I'd been doing Grant, portraying General and President Grant for about 15 years. Chris had seen me do some portrayals presentations, and we had met. And as I said, while I can't remember actually meeting Chris, seems like he's always been there. Uh, he was, as he told me, very much taken with my portrayal, and got to thinking about me writing a book. We we talked about it, and a couple of things that happened in the process, the pre-book writing process. He asked me, "Do you want to write a full biography of Grant?" And I said, "No, I do not want to write the big book, the 600 to 1200 pages of text. I don't want to, as Grant said, when asked about writing his memoirs before he was forced to write them, he said, "No, I'm not going to write a book. I'm not going to add to that pile. Those other fellows are all writing enough books. I don't need to add to the pile." And I told Chris that I felt something akin to that. And I didn't want to take the 5 to 6 years to write that big a book, and there are plenty of them being written. But then he brought up the emerging Civil War series and the Savage Beatty books, of which I was very pleased to say, familiar. The Savage Beatty books are the paperbacks, and they're like, this book is 163 pages of text, a number of photographs, a lot of maps, and they're essentially, there are two things. This book is the mission, it fulfills the mission. It's essentially a handbook for the person, in this case, Grant, or the place, a battle about which you are reading. And it's meant to be more than an introduction. It's not elementary school level, but they're meant to be an introduction to pique your interest to go on and read more about the person, Grant, or about the battle. Anything where there are something, I think some 10,500 recognized fights or battles in the Civil War. And whichever one you're writing about, and all of them in the Savage Beatty Publishing Emerging Civil War series, they're all good books written by men and women who are authorities in about which they are writing, and they should pique your interest for you to go on as the reader to pursue and learn more about the person or the place, the event. And these books are paperback. They fulfill, as I told Chris, these books fulfill the true original purpose of paperback books. You know, they were originally called pocket books. They were meant to be stuck in your back pocket and carried with you, portable reading to be read whenever you had an opportunity. These books go back and fulfill that initial mission or concept of paperback books. They are portable, they're lightweight, they are packed with information and the maps and the photos, and they're meant for you to take in the field with you. Take them, read them, bend them back, mark them, fold corners, wear them out in the pursuit of learning more about what the book is telling you, person, place, or event. And I really liked being invited. I was honored to be invited to be a part of this series of books. And then we began talking. Chris said, "What kind of book do you want to write?" And I said, "Well, I like the concept of these books." And they're 45, 50,000 words, which sounds like a lot of words. Give you a comparison. Grant's memoirs, 2 volumes, they're 295,000 words. 295,000 words. That's 2 volumes, 1,200 pages, 70 chapters. So 45,000 words is not that big a book, but it's enough to thoroughly cover the subject, person, place, or event. So with Grant, Chris, who is the editor, and Chris edited the book for me, and Chris structured the book and added. We've talked about this. I wrote the book, and then in the editing process, Chris added, I would say, 25% of the material that's in the book in the process of putting it together. And I'll tell you momentarily how that came about. But in putting it together and structuring it, Chris added, and I'm grateful he asked me if he could. Certainly, whatever you want to add, Chris. Because, well, Chris Mikowski is just Chris Mikowski with his vast knowledge of the war and his intimate knowledge of the Eastern Theater, the last year of the war. Uh, and as he structured it and assembled it, got the photos and the maps, and put it in, he added some material here and there. He did it so seamlessly. I have difficulty telling what he added to what I have written. So he richly deserves co-authorship with it. He did put my name first, and so he co-authored it, and that's how he wove into the context or the content of the book as he structured it. Well, I had tried to write, and because I am so busy, and I do not mean to say I'm so busy, I'm richly blessed, and I am very, very busy in doing Grant and President Grant portrayals. And I wasn't getting into the telegraph office and pounding the telegraph keys to get enough content down. And I had written already, I'd written from birth through the Mexican War with Chris. Now, in putting this sequence together, I'll tie in with podcasts. But let me go back. I had written about from birth through West Point and the Mexican War. And I pointed out to Chris, it is so ironic with Grant himself that he had said, I like to read biographies. In fact, biographies was his favorite genre of reading. Mark Twain was his favorite author, Sam Clemens, and his favorite book was Innocents Abroad, with which he took with him when he and Julia made that famous 2.5 year round the world tour. And he marked every country that they went through, going back and cross-referencing with what Twain had written in Innocents Abroad. But I had written, I sat down and did write birth all the way through the Mexican War and him going to being assigned to the Pacific Northwest, where he went without Julia. And as I wrote that and sent the installments to Chris for his editing, uh, after a few of my submissions to him, he said, "Hey, pal," and if you know Chris, you could hear him saying that, "Hey, pal, we need to talk." And the expression "we need to talk" carries all kinds of connotations with it, depending on who says it and the tone of voice. But I said, "Sure. What do you want to talk about?" And he said, "Well, you you've written, you've already blown through about 50,000 words, and we haven't gotten through the Mexican War yet." Uh, and it was at that point that I was reminded that it's so ironic about Grant. Grant said he liked to read the biographies, his favorite form, but he preferred the biographies that had extensive coverage of the person as a boy. That the boy is indeed father to the man. And he said, I don't care to read biographies that don't have extensive coverage of the childhood. Yet he himself, in that 1,200 pages, 295,000 words, 70 chapters, memoirs, he covered birth to graduation from West Point in 18 pages. The man who had said, I really don't care for biographies that don't extensively treat the childhood, himself went from birth to age 21 in only 18 pages. He didn't go into much depth about his childhood. But my point here is the piling up of the words. And Chris said, well, we've got a problem. a pleasant problem to deal with. How long do you want this to be? What can you do? And I had told him, I don't know how I could reduce what I'm doing. And I thought about Grant. The first draft of his memoirs were as dull as dirt. And when the editor uh, Underwood went out to him, and I think Robert Underwood told him, Richard Gilder Watson, the publisher of Century Publishing, sent Robert Underwood out to Grant to try to get him to write something other than a report. Robert Underwood Johnson, and Johnson got him to talking and became animated and told Grant, that's what you need to write. What you just told me is what you need to put on paper. And Grant didn't know any different. He'd written extensively professionally, but he'd never written for an audience other than a subordinate or a superior officer. Robert Underwood Johnson said, write what you just told me in that manner, and people will enjoy it, which in truth they did, and to this day still do. And Chris asked me, and of course I told Chris, I related all of this to Chris. And Chris asked me again, well, do you want to go ahead and write a full-blown biography of Grant? Well, of course, yes, that appeals to me. But I still will stand firmly on what I had said earlier in this time that I spent with you. I didn't want to write that full-blown thing. I always think about it, the big book. I think about Gene Edward Smith's Grant and Ron White's American Ulysses, which is about 700 pages. Chernow's book, I think it's 1,165 pages. Men who've done excellent work, devoted years of research. I didn't want to write anything that in depth. I didn't think it necessary. Better writers than I have already treated it, and I didn't want to take the time. I wanted a more hands-on, topical, go out and look at what I'm writing about on the ground, or this is good. I want to know more about Grant, or where Grant was and what he did. And I said, that's what I want to do. So Chris said, well, I said, you can, I don't know how I do anything different. I can't write any different than what I'm doing. And you as the editor will put the pencil to it and shape and craft as editors do. And Chris is an excellent editor. Chris has no superiors in editing books. And I said, I trust you to edit it. He said, I don't want to do that so much at all. I'm glad he said it. He said, I like very much, Curt, what you've written, and I like how you're writing. The problem is fitting what you've got into a Savas Beatty 165, 65, 75 page book. And there's the dilemma. And I again said, I don't know how I could do anything. I can't write differently. I don't want to omit anything because, of course, being a writer, I think it's all important. Not that what I write is important. No, don't mistake me for having said that. I don't know what for the reader is important to leave out or to leave in. That's where the editor must step in. And I trust you explicitly to implicitly to edit the book. And so he pauses and he said, well, and I broke in. I said, well, you can just scrap what you've done, or do you want to keep it? He said, no. I'm not dumping anything. What you've written is good. And I think people, again, he was very kind. He said, I think people would want to read it, but you've got too much for what we have at hand. Why don't we'll keep what you've written and we'll edit it later. Let's confine this book to just the war, April to April, 61, 65, and what Grant did in the war, and in so much as you can write it, will write it, how he did what he did, why he did what he did, or why he did not do what he didn't do. For example, no entrenchments or breastworks at Shiloh. And Grant says very clearly, I didn't do that because it was early in the war. Remember now, the war started April the 12th of 61. Shiloh was fought just 53 weeks later on April 6th and 7th of 62. There had been fights, to be sure. There had been some battles, indeed, even Fort Donelson with Grant, and some savage fighting. But there had not been on the North American continent anything of the scope of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing. The gates of hell opened for 2 days, and the men of both sides, those who survived it, were forever changed. And when Shiloh, the casualty list for Shiloh were released, and there were people killed and wounded at Shiloh as far away as California, and the shadow of death spread across the country like an ink blot across a map. And there was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and people saying, my God, what have we done? But it was too late. The war, both sides were firmly locked in a war that Grant said, this war is going to be fought. It's going to be a long and bloody war, and it's going to be fought until one side or the other, holding principles so dear as unto death, is going to have to yield those principles to the other side. And I submit to you, my friends, that's exactly what happened 36 months later. It took that long. So Chris said, let's confine the writing just to the war. And I said, great. April to April sounds good. And I began to thinking about that. But I still, now we're getting to what I want you to know, the behind the covers of the book. And just for your information, there's a gnat flying around in here. So occasionally when I do this, I've got that you can't see on the screen, but I've got a gnat that's trying to land on my nose all the time during our time together. I wasn't getting enough done because I was so busy. As I said earlier, I'm richly blessed. I stay busy and becoming more so. So Chris came up with the idea that I personally think is excellent. He said, hey, Curt, why don't we do this? I've got all your stuff pre-Civil War. We'll do something. We'll edit that later. So you see, my friends, the prequel to Unconditional Surrender, Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War, is already written. It needs but to be edited, and we'll do the same thing with that. We'll come out with it later. Now, Chris said, are you amenable to, let's do podcasts? And he was kind. He said, you're a good storyteller. Narrate the parts of the war. Let's start at the beginning of the war. We'll do a podcast. And just as I am sitting here, as you're watching this program now, as Grant in first person, let's talk through the Civil War in podcast segments. And I will take the transcripts, because the program that I've got will print out a transcript of everything said. And I'll send you the transcript. You take the transcript and massage it, edit it to where it flows the way you want it to read. maybe add something, which I did very little of. I've added very little to the transcripts once I got them as I was editing, and then send the edited transcript back to me, and I will edit it for placement in the book. So uh, I I was particularly taken with that idea. And we began. And Chris also said, so we get bonus bucks out of this. Emerging Civil War, and our public gets a whole series of podcasts from General Grant about the war in sequential segments. And you get transcripts to edit, and we both get a book. So this book was written in a series of podcasts, all of which are on Emerging Civil War in their archives. And I get the narrative, I edit the narrative, send it back to Chris. Chris edits what I've sent him and formats it to put in the book. So that's how this book was written. This book is, when you read the book, if you can, now that you've heard me talk about it, when you read the book, if you can in your mind, it's like a talking book that you're reading, and the narrative is in your own mind. Try to read the book thinking of how I sound with me reading it to you, because that's how it was written in a series of podcasts, all of which you can see on Emerging Civil War. Now, Chris also asked me about the photographs in the book, and I want to emphasize this. The book is peppered throughout, as all Emerging Civil War and Sabbath Beatty publications are, a lot of pictures and a lot of maps. And Chris has the staff map guy that was kind enough to do the maps for my book. A lot of maps, a lot of photos. Almost all the photos in the book are photos of me as General Grant at the locations about which you are reading in the book. For example, Grant at Brown's Ferry, Grant at the meeting house at Shiloh, and so forth. Now, Chris has a disclaimer in the book, and that he wrote. He told me about it before the book went to press. And he said, "I put this in here that to the reader, to you, the reader, that the photos for the most part are Curt Fields as General Grant in the locations where Grant was about which Curt's writing." Because Chris said, "Curt, you've got so many great photos of you in all these places where you're about which you are writing. And I want to take advantage of that to show your resemblance to Grant, and also to show, at least in small part, a piece of the ground where about which you are writing where you are." And we can do that because there are so many photos. And I'm fortunate, I never take any photos. A lot of people take photos around me, and they're kind enough to send them to me. And I want the reader to know that it was my idea as the editor to use pictures of you rather than original pictures of Grant himself, because of the reasons I just gave. And I was grateful to him for that, because I didn't want anybody to think or come back to me and say, "Hey, what, you got the big head here? We got pictures of you." Well, it's not me that did it. Now, I'm very pleased that Chris saw fit to use photos of me in the different areas, but it wasn't ego on my part. It was editorial decision making and favor of the editor to take pictures of the places about which you are reading of Grant there in that place. Brown's Ferry. There's a photo of me standing at Brown's Ferry with Lookout Mountain in the background, and I'm standing where the ferries docked, anchored for the Cracker Line to come across into Chattanooga. I mean, that's the place. And to be sure, Lookout Mountain hasn't moved. So the photo that was taken of me uh, was very accurately, geographically accurate. This is where the Cracker Line anchored to get food into Chattanooga. And Anthony Hodges, Dr. Anthony Hodges, a retired dentist in Chattanooga, authority on the Battle of Chattanooga. Anthony Hodges of the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association took that photo of me. So the pictures in the book that show me as Grant in the different places was a decision made by Chris. And I'm glad he did, but I want to lift up that Chris was kind enough to say, hey, if you have a complaint, it was me, not Curt, that decided to do it. But I'm glad he did use the photos. The only thing that was a disagreement, the only suggestion that Chris made that I did not go along with was at the end, because Chris had wanted, and I have no issue with it. Chris had wanted to have me go back into Washington City, take it a little bit past the surrender. And I thought, and told him, let's stop it at Appomattox rather than carry it back into Washington City and what Grant was doing there, busily sending the armies home, canceling contracts and so forth, dealing with Andrew Johnson. How about we stop it there at Appomattox? The war ended there now. Essentially, it ended there. There are some, I think, 16 surrenders after Lee surrendered. But as everyone knew, Lee and Grant both knew that the dominoes would start to fall when Lee surrendered. So one must say the war essentially ended at Appomattox. And I asked Chris, can we just stay with, let's stop it at Appomattox? And the next book, which is going to cover the 4 years of Andrew Johnson's administration. I'll give you, this is what is it, would this be considered a preview, a trailer? We're going to do the prequel of Grant from birth through West Point and so forth. And we're going to do a sequel. Indeed, the prequel's already been written, just needs editing. We're going to do a sequel that I've talked with Chris, and he said he liked the idea. I want to do the 4 years between the Appomattox and Grant taking office as the 18th president, because it's that 4 years that made Grant decide, even though he did not want to be president, he didn't want to hold public office. Grant came to feel, as Sherman had said, or Sherman gave him a good cussing about it. But why did you do it? And Grant said, I didn't want to be president, but I did it because if I did not run for the presidency, everything that you and I and 2 million United States soldiers and sailors did in that war would be for naught, lost to trading politicians. So the 4 years between Lincoln and Grant, the Andrew Johnson administration, and the beginning of the horror that was Reconstruction, was it's not talked about enough in what Grant was doing. So I proposed to Chris that I do a book. I'm going to call it Prelude to the Presidency. Grant during the Johnson administration, or something like that, a subtitle, but the title is going to be Prelude to the Presidency, and already working on that. But Chris agreed to stop it at Appomattox. So the 4 years goes April to April. Uh, I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed putting to paper and then talking as I am now with you. I enjoyed telling the story of Grant during the war. And I repeatedly said, and I'll say with you now, Grant is one of the, if not the greatest man of irony in American history, specifically in world history in general. There are so many ironic occurrences in Grant's life that he should never have been able to do what he did. But through circumstance, happenstance, one thing after another turned in his favor and allowed him to ascend unto the position that he held. And he's so critical because when you look, the warrior and the savior, Lincoln, Grant and Lincoln, uh, if you look at the people who ran for the presidency against Lincoln, he was the only one who could do what he did. The other men, Breckinridge, who indeed became a Confederate general, and Stephen Douglas, they split the Democratic Party and the independent candidate. In fact, his name slips me now. None of those three men could have held the country together. None of them. So, but Lincoln won. Grant, if you look at the war, uh, the Grant won the war in the West, and there's the camp of thought the war was won in the West, and the war was won in the East. I personally am in the camp of the Civil War was actually really won in the West. And then Grant went in that last year and defeated Lee. And ultimately, when the Army of Northern Virginia was defeated, the war was over with the combat and the leadership and the time the South was worn out. But the the issue of leadership, there had been all those, six different men commanding the Army of the Potomac, two if you count George McClellan twice, and he certainly did. Uh, for 3 years, the Army of the Potomac had crossed the Potomac or the Rapidan or the Rappahannock or some river, gone across the river, been mauled by Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. They drugged themselves back across the river, bleeding and battered, rested, refitted, changed commanders, and sallied forth across the river again to repeat the process. When Grant, and I always keep in mind as I tell people in presentations, Grant was not the commander of the Army of the Potomac. George Meade was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant was the general in chief. Grant was commanding 1,000,000 men. When Grant took command in March, now he received the commission as the first lieutenant general since Washington on March the 9th. I think on March the 11th, the orders issued by President Lincoln that Grant was to be the general in chief with headquarters in the field. And that's in the orders, headquarters in the field. There were 1,000,000 men. There were 650,000 under arms in the field, 350,000 at home on leave for various reasons. And Grant called most of them back, those who medically could return. But Grant was in command of 1,000,000 men, all the way from Washington to Galveston, Texas to California, the entire Union Army. But he traveled headquarters to the field with Meade. When Grant crossed the Rappahannock to go against Lee on May the 4th, 64, he took 120,000 men across the river, 4,000 wagons, 56,000 horses and mules, numbers for those who care for them. But the number that I would like you to remember, and because it focuses specifically on Grant and Lincoln, and why Lincoln wanted Grant to be the general in chief. When Grant crossed the Rappahannock River, or the Rapidan River, rather, when Grant crossed the Rapidan to go against Robert E. Lee in May of 1864, it was time, the seventh time that the Army of the Potomac had crossed a river to engage Lee. The seventh time in 36 months. That's why Grant was there, because Lincoln knew that Grant would engage Lee and fight him until one or the other could no longer fight. And that's why Grant was there. That is specifically, solely why Grant was where he was, going across that river to meet Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, the seventh time the Army of the Potomac had crossed that river. It had to stop. It had to end one way or the other. And that, when you look at the leadership, Grant had ascended up and up and up in the Western Theater, taken two armies in surrender, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, 47 to 50,000 men in surrender. He'd rescued Rosecrans' army at Chattanooga and essentially destroyed Bragg and the Army of Mississippi. And there was no other military leader in the war that could do what Grant did. Search the history of the war. Nobody else was doing what Grant did. Nobody else could do what Grant did. And that's why Grant was where he was. How many times, as I said, had the Army of the Potomac changed horses in the mid-river, as Mr. Lincoln liked to put it? So I submit to you that Grant was the only man who could win, who could lead those forces to victory, which he did. Lincoln was the only man running for the presidency in 1860 who could sustain the country and through the war and keep it together. Look at who else was running. Indeed, Douglas died in, I believe, 62. Douglas would have died in office had he been elected. So the irony of Grant, I tried to lift up in the book, and the story of what Grant did, as I said earlier, why he did what he did, and when I could, why he didn't do what he didn't do. So the book is, I think, it time to bring my remarks with you to a close. The book is, I have been told by people who've read it, an easy read. It's, I hope, an informative read. And I hope you read it. Oh, I need to say Nick Sacco, park ranger at Whitehaven, Ulysses Grant National Park there in Whitehaven. Nick Sacco wrote a good introduction, and I'm very pleased with Nick having done it, been considered to do it. The book is a collaborative effort, and I hope you enjoy it. Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War by myself, Curt Fields, and Chris Mikowski. Please get a copy, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, or if you don't enjoy it, let me know. Ulysses S. Grant in the American Civil War, and Savas Beatty Publishing, Emerging Civil War Series. I hope you enjoy it. And for the moment, I'm Curt Fields, the author, and I believe I have said quite enough. Oh, and if you wish to contact me, my e-telegraph address here at headquarters is Curt Fields, CurtFields, Curt Fields at generalgrantbyhimself.com. I answer all my e-telegrams, and I'm always glad to hear from anyone who's interested in General Grant, President Grant, or the Civil War, or anyone else in the Civil War. So if you feel like you'd like to reach out and contact me, please do so. curtfields@generalgrantbyhimself.com. And I've said quite enough. It is time for me to take my leave. Please enjoy the book.